Welcome, my name is Germán Retana from INCAE Business School in Costa Rica, and this video is about a security plan, which is a tool that every business executive should know in order to better align his or her investments in IT security with business strategy. So this video is not very technical in nature, rather it only intends to offer the business executive the intuition needed for him or her to go and talk to CIOs or security experts and work together along with those persons in the development of the security plan. In this video, we will start covering first off some motivation and understand why you should care about IT security. Why is this important for the business person? We will then go and quickly overview the three main goals of IT security, and then we're going to dive into the security plan that has as main objective to protect those three goals. We will start by talking about what is the security plan and of course dive into its three basic elements, which are threats, assets, and controls. We wrap up this video with a summary of the framework and also some final considerations that you should take to your firms. So let's start talking about IT security and why it should matter to you, why it should matter a lot to you. This thing about IT security is not really a new thing in business. We've been talking about security in firms like forever. And we've used security always to protect things we care about. We could call these things we care about assets. And since the Middle Ages, we've been using locks, barriers, and guards to protect these assets. Now what we're protecting is information, and we protect it with passwords, certificates, encryption, and plenty other controls, some of which we're going to mention briefly today. Overall, what has happened is that the computer and the internet have redefined what we understand by security and in particular by IT-related risk in business. So how big is this problem? Well, it is immensely big and it is growing very fast. A 2015 study by PricewaterhouseCoopers found that there's a compound annual growth rate of security incidents of 66%. So every year there are 66% more incidents than the year before it. If you know your math, you know there's an exponential curve, and basically it's a battle that we've pretty much lost. There's no way we can actually stop the trend of the growing number of security incidents. And these are only the security incidents we actually detect. Something relevant, which is highlighted by the Verizon 2016 report shown on the right, is that not all attacks are the Hollywoodesque hacker type of attacks. Although they are the majority, there are many attacks coming through malware or through other techniques that do not even involve software. They involve what we call as social engineering, which is basically infiltrating a system just by asking questions and fooling people by talking to them. Other issues that are more related to user education along with social engineering are simply error or misuse of the tools we have. But these are less present in the industry. The most important ones are the hackers, malwares, and social engineers. What's important, however, if you compare both studies, is that both of them show this clearly exponential growth trend in the number of attacks. And you'd think that this might eventually stop, but it won't, because there's money in this. In fact, finance, money, is the primary motive by perpetrators in performing these attacks. This also comes from the 2016 Verizon report, and they find that the financial motivation is the key motivation behind this. The secondary motivation is not too distant from this one, is espionage, which of course also has very business-oriented focuses. Note that the idea of hacking just by pure fun is not what really is driving hackers nowadays. If there's money into this, it means that someone is paying for this cost, and in fact there's a lot of money going into this. The graph I'm showing you from the Ponemon Institute comes from a 2016 study that analyzed what was the average total cost for a firm to withstand a security breach and how has this changed over time. We can see that even though the cost is higher in the US and in other countries, what we do find is a clear growth trend in any given country. So as years have passed, in this particular graph from 2014 towards 2016, in every single country, the cost of these security breaches has been increasing. This is a big problem, and we would be at least comforted by knowing that the financial losses were the only losses we could have. But in terms of impact, there is so much more than just money impacting firms. there are several indirect costs to security. For example, think about credibility. How much credibility does a firm lose after suffering a security incident? Something very hard about this is that buyer trust, consumer trust, is much harder to regain than financial losses. We all know from the marketing field that it is much easier to acquire a new customer than to recover a customer that we have already lost. In this sense, once we lose credibility from our customers, it's going to be very, very hard to bring them back. And this will be particularly true if we're dealing with financial data of our clients. Now, this impacts not only our clients, but also our direct operations. If, because of security incident, our systems comes down and we suffer downtime, we might start losing sales because we stop our operations. When we talk about downtime, we're referring to the time during which our mission critical applications or overall our information systems are not operating. It is the opposite of uptime. And usually we talk about downtime in terms of percentages. And for example, a firm or a provider might offer us an SLA, a service level agreement, by which the provider commits to having a 99.9% of uptime. What does this mean? It means that on any given time period, they guarantee that they're going to be up 99.9% of the time. If this time frame were a year, then these three nines, the 99.9%, imply that the provider is committing to only being down, only having a downtime of a maximum of about 8.76 hours, which might not be acceptable in many settings, case in which we want to have 4 nines. So if someone commits to be up for 99.99% of the time, then that means that over a year, the expectation is that it will only be down for at most 53 minutes. And if this is still too much downtime for you, you might seek for a provider who offers you an SLA with 5 nines, which is going to be up around 99.999% of the time. This would only involve at most 5.26 minutes of downtime per year. So again, this is the concept of downtime, is when we're down. And think about its business implications. Imagine that you have an online store, a big online retailer, and you have downtime. Basically, having downtime in an e-commerce website is the equivalent of locking the doors of a retail brick and mortar store. We are shutting down the business. Or imagine, what are the cost implications of downtime for an online banking system? So we start thinking about what could we do to protect ourselves. And one easy approach or a common approach is, hey, no worries, we're just going to sue whomever attacks us. But sadly, in IT security, legal countermeasures are just not enough for several reasons. One is that laws, almost by definition, will come to legislate and regulate technologies that existed before the laws existed. So technology will always precede legislation because you cannot regulate something that does not yet exist. We're not sure how people are going to be communicating, how firms are going to be communicating, how are they going to be storing data, how are they going to be using data 3-5 years from now. So it's very hard for lawyers to come up with laws to protect us against that. So in general, they're going to be becoming slow. And moreover, since they're becoming slow, once we are hit, really, the legal protection is useless because we have already been hit. By the time we find the law that allows us to punish the perpetrator, it is quite likely that our firms are actually already bankrupt because we lost sales, we lost operations, we lost customer trust, and we were not able to recover from that. Now, even in the hypothetical case that laws were formulated and enforced quickly enough, it would still be hard to actually enforce them. And the reason for this is that attacks can come from anywhere in the world. The attacks will generally come over the internet, and the internet is a global phenomenon. For instance, if you happen to find the hacker, and the hacker is in some Middle East country, in Eastern Europe or in Asia, how are you going to punish that particular hacker? And once again, this is granted you actually know who the hacker was. It's going to be very, very hard. A natural conclusion from this discussion is how some lawyers tend to say, sometimes the law will simply not give you the solution. And there's a close cousin to the legal structure, which are norms, which help but have some deficiencies, but I'm going to come back to that in just a second. When we say that we're following norms, we're seeking to be compliant with some standard or to be certified under this standard. And overall, these are good things. I mean, we have norms that dictate what are the good practices or the best practices in several fields. And for instance, if you have experience in the finance industry, you must be aware of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which has a lot of practices on how firms should manage their financial information. How should this information be managed? What should be disclosed? What not? When should it be disclosed? And so forth. Another field that has very strict regulation is health. And the Health Insurance Reportability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA Act, has very strict measures on what hospitals and clinics can and should do with client, or more precisely, patient data. Anyone who deals with credit card data must be compliant with the payment card industry standard. And PCI, for instance, requires firms to have their clients' identifying information in a different database from the credit card information. That way, some people could steal the credit card numbers but not know who those credit cards belong to, or know who their clients are but not have access to their credit card data. And this is just one of the many measures that you must satisfy in order to be PCI compliant. The standards have gone to the extent that now there's even an ISO standard, the 27001, which offers firms a long checklist very similar to the ISO 9000 for quality purposes. But then again, these are all big checklists, and auditors are going to come to the firm and verify that the firms satisfy all the different items in the checklist. But all of this is paper. And just as legal structures, norms are only paper unless we actually implement them and do something about them. In security, what really matters are the actions, not so much what you have written that you are planning to do. So what we should do is develop a concise strategy that is geared towards what actions will we be taking in a constant manner, and we need to be revising the actions we're taking. And this is all what goes into the security plan. And we're going to talk about this framework next. In order to talk about the security plan, we first have to overview the three main goals of security. And remember, the security plan is going to fight to defend these three goals. And it's easy to remember at least their initials, which are CIA. C stands for confidentiality. When we're talking about confidentiality, we're talking about protecting the client and other proprietary data from unauthorized access. We want that only the people who are supposed to have access to certain portions of information and data have access to it, that the data remains confidential. Once we have been able to authenticate the users and we know that the person that is trying to have access to the data is supposed to have access to the data, we need to ensure that we preserve the integrity of the data. And this is the second objective. We're trying to have data that is not corrupt, that is readable, that has not been tampered with. And if the data is correct, if it satisfies the integrity goal, and I have already verified that I have the authorization to access the data which satisfies the confidentiality goal, the last goal we must satisfy is that of accessibility, which means I actually have access to my data. Think of the impact of downtime on an internet connection. It doesn't matter where the data is, it doesn't matter that you have correct authentication mechanisms, you just don't have access to that data, which in turn renders the data useless. So when we're seeking to ensure accessibility, we're trying to ensure that all the users enjoy an uninterrupted service of the hardware and software architecture with our systems. So these are our three goals, and they are affected or put at risk by a series of threats. And when we talk about threats, usually we tend to think in the Hollywood manner, and Hollywood brings us hackers. But this is not all there is to say about threats. In fact, one of the most common type of threats are going to be business continuity threats. What are these? These are, and they all start with the D, so they're actually easy to remember. Disruptions, destruction, or disasters. What are we talking about here? A disruption is simply a temporary interruption of our services. Something goes down for a brief amount of time, and the service is interrupted or disrupted. The data is still there, it's only that we don't have access to it. Another type of business continuity threat is destruction of the data. Think of a virus that, for example, alters the data and renders it useless. Now the data is corrupt and we have destroyed the data. We could also have different types of failures here, such as hard disk failures. If my computer burns and I lose my hard drives, I'm going to lose my data. The data is practically destroyed. And we finally have disasters, which could be natural disasters such as earthquakes, floods, or fires, or also human disasters. Think of, for example, a truck driver who hits a post where our fiber optic cables were passing by and because of that car accident, a firm is offline and out of the internet. This is a business continuity threat. Overall, then, the business continuity threats are going to affect the integrity and accessibility goals of security. The second type of threat we can talk about are intrusion threats. And here we are talking about hackers, or overall people who infiltrate our systems to access data to which they were not supposed to have access. Now, not all are external hackers, which are the ones we usually think about. In many occasions, in fact, about a third of the attacks are actually coming from internal collaborators. And this could be ill-intentioned or just by error. We could have, for instance, a collaborator that we just fired and decides to copy some files to a USB drive and run away with data that he wants to use later to damage our firm or simply to give to our competition. Whatever it is, this employee, or former employee more precisely, is angry with us and wants to cause us damage. Now, not necessarily an employee must be angry with the firm in order to cause the firm damage. Think of a very different example. Think of an intern who was just hired to do some very important job, and the intern wants to do the best effort possible to satisfy his new boss. And this intern, with the sole purpose of doing the best job and giving it all and spending the entire night working, this intern might actually copy data onto a USB drive and take it home to work. However, on the way home, someone steals the backpack where the USB drive was stored, and he loses the firm data with the best of the intentions. So internal collaborators can harm us either by evil or by benign intentions. Either way, it's a security risk. And finally, going back to the motivation behind security breaches, which were financial, the idea of wanting to hack something because I want to perform industrial espionage by committing fraud or by tampering data, all these are possible, and they would fall in the category of intrusion. So intrusion very broadly can affect the three goals of security, confidentiality, integrity, or accessibility. Now, once we are able to enumerate all the threats, we know that not all threats are equal, and we need some way of prioritizing threats. Very similar to how we prioritize risks in the project management field, we are going to define the priority of threats based on their probability of occurrence and the cost for the firm if this threat were to occur. So we're basically going to have a framework where we're going to place the threats in this area, and the farther to the top right of these two axes we can place a threat, then the higher priority that this threat represents for the firm. And let me give you some examples. There are some threats that are very, very popular that can occur at any point in time, yet represent a very low cost to recover for the firms. Examples of these are unwanted spam to our email boxes or simply unwanted advertising. These are not really going to affect us in a great deal, but they're annoying, they're always there, they're very popular. Moving up a notch, and something that might cause us some damage, we find viruses, which again are very, very popular. They can get into our firm by many different ways, but overall they're not particularly damaging to us. Now, these are the normal or low-end kind of viruses. There are some other malware, malicious software, such as spyware, keylogs, botnets, even worms or trojans that overall we could say have a stronger impact or more negative consequences for our firms. These are going to be not as popular, but certainly causes more damage. One type of attack or one threat that is getting increasingly popular and increasingly dangerous too is phishing, which is an attack that fools buyers, fools customers, or even users into thinking that they're using the original system they're trying to use, but they're really accessing some alternate and fake website. Someone could build a mock-up of a bank's website and ask for usernames and passwords pretending to be the bank, and the website is going to look exactly like the original bank's website, only that it's not. And then by using the fake forms, users are going to very, very easily give away their usernames and passwords. Another type of attack that is very, very dangerous, yet still nowadays does not happen to every firm, I mean, they happen every day, just not to everyone, are distributed denial of service attacks. When a denial of service attack occurs, what is happening is that the firm, the target, the victim, is receiving a flood of messages that basically overwhelms its systems and saturates them to the point that they are off the grid, that they are useless. a closely related attack in the sense that it doesn't happen to everyone unless it's a massive attack like the WannaCry attack that happened in 2017 is ransomware. When someone suffers a ransomware attack, basically all the files in that individual's workstations or in the server are encrypted, and the perpetrators ask for a ransom, for a monetary sum, in exchange for the decryption of the files. Once again, these are not extremely popular, but when they happen, they're pretty much devastating. And of course, the biggest threat that one can have is that someone steals our data, and the data could be stolen by either an external hacker or by our own collaborators, and this last threat can happen with either negative or positive intentions. So far we've mentioned the security goals we're protecting. We've looked at the threats that put these goals at risk. We have prioritized the threats, but what can we do about the threats? Well, we implement controls to protect the security goals from these particular threats. And these are mechanisms we're going to use to mitigate or eliminate the threats. There are three broad types of controls. The first ones are controls meant to prevent a threat. We're trying to reduce the probability that a security incident occurs, and we're trying to act as a deterrent by discouraging or restraining the attack. In this sense, we're trying to work like a doctor, whereby it is better to take pills and eat well and be healthy before we get sick, because it's much easier to do it when we're healthy than to recover from when we fall ill. However, if you remember the rate at which the incidents are growing, this is almost a lost battle. I'm not saying that we should not invest in prevention, but we should also start investing on what are we going to do when we get attacked. Because the question is not if we get attacked and we suffer a security incident, but when will we suffer one. So a first step in this direction will be to actually detect an attack. Many firms have data stolen from them and don't realize that until a few months or even years later. An example close to this was the Panama Papers, which happened in 2016, where the legal firm that owns the data in the Panama Papers did not realize that their data was stolen until a year after the data was stolen from their systems. So what we're trying to do is to reveal or uncover these unwanted elements. We might install the intrusion prevention system to detect when something's going on, and at a minimum we want to keep on records and logs, history logs, of what has happened, because there's actually a new field called cyber forensics, which kind of try to backtrack into evidence of what has happened in the systems to try to determine, for instance, how is it that a hacker got into a system. But if a firm is not keeping detailed logs of their network communications, such kind of forensic analysis will be actually impossible. Now, granted that we were attacked and that we are aware that we were attacked, the final thing we would like to do is to actually correct whatever happened. We want to remedy the damage or the impact of the incident or the undesired intrusion. So here we might be talking about disaster recovery plans and, broadly speaking, just responses to whenever we suffer an attack or suffer from a threat. And these controls are designed to protect assets. So let's talk about IT assets now. This is what we are trying to protect. By far, the most important asset any firm has is data. If there is something that a firm will regret losing, is its data. And I like to make an analogy here with a car accident. Whenever someone has a car accident, what family or friends are going to ask first is, are you okay? Are you alive? Are you healthy? And why are they asking this? Well, because they know that the life of the person in the car is the most important thing. If the car was totaled, if the car was damaged, that can be eventually replaced. I mean, it's not free, it is not cheap, but it is nothing more than metal and iron that can be fixed, that can be replaced. However, the human life cannot be replaced. So same thing happens with data. Once we lose the data, we cannot really recover it. All the other things we can rebuy, we can reinstall, but once we lose the data, there's nothing we can do. Second in order, we might find what we call mission critical applications. And these are the software applications that a firm needs to operate. Basically, if a firm suffers downtime in its mission critical application, it is out of business. This is the e-commerce website for an online retailer, the online portal for a bank. This is the ERP system for a manufacturing firm. Without these systems, the firm is out of business. And note that there are many other software applications, such as an Office suites installed in users' workstations, that are not that critical for firms. So firms can distinguish mission critical from non-mission critical software. And here's where basically the rest of the assets, the rest of the hardware and software fall into. We can always acquire them again and replace them, but the first two types of assets, data and mission critical applications, these are the ones that can determine if a firm goes bankrupt or if it survives a security incident. Now, something that should be to some extent clear by now is that assigning priority to the assets, it's a strategic matter, and it is not an IT decision. And by this I mean it is not a decision that should be left exclusively to IT departments. Why? Because the priority of an asset should not be based on its book value. It should not be based on how much did the hard drive cost me, how much did the server cost me, how much did the software license cost me. The priority of an asset should be based on more business-oriented criteria, such as what is the lost revenue that we would have if this asset were to come down? If we did not have this asset, how much sales are going to be lost? Of course, the cost of replacing the asset and the time we're going to need from our staff are going to be parts of the equation. But the first and foremost factor we should use to decide how important an asset is to the firm is how relevant it is to the firm's strategy. And of course, if we're talking about firm strategy, coming back to the prior point, this is not something that is under sole control of the CIO of a firm. Just to aid your imagination and your understanding of the scope of this issue, let me give you some examples of IT assets. And this is not expected to be an exhaustive list, it's just a list designed to open your minds into all the different things that CIOs and security departments are concerned about. Let's start off with hardware. And when we talk about hardware, we're talking about physical things. Some of them are the servers, the physical servers where we installed our production applications, our mail servers, and even some other hardware where more IT-related services such as the domain name server or dynamic host control protocol server, the DNS and DHCP, these are things that CIOs know about and that they are critical for the network to actually operate. If you don't have one of these, your network is not going to operate. Of course, we have the workstations of users, their laptops, and we have network devices such as routers, switches, and access points, which enable communication between computers. Having the data somewhere is important. Being able to access that data, remember, is also important, which is why network devices are so important. We also have an organization's data. We've already talked extensively about this. The databases where we have our clients' data are critical to a firm. Similarly, we also already talked about mission-critical apps. Every firm will have its own, and they're going to vary from industry, vary from firm. Once again, it's a very strategic decision. We must also protect our networks at varying geographical scopes. We could have local area networks or backbone networks, or we could go internationally in wide area networks and even links over the internet. We also have different software elements, which include not only the ERP applications such as an SAP or an Oracle or a NetSuite, but also the operating system on top of which those applications are running. We also have the operating systems of our users' laptops, the Windows or Mac OS operating systems. Even Android or iOS operating systems should be protected too. And last but not least, we have other softwares such as the Office suites that users use to work on a daily basis, but are not as important as an ERP system, for example. Once again, these are just examples. So now let's put all these together in what we call the security plan. And once again, this security plan is a tool, a framework, which offers firms a good step to start securing their digitized platform. We're going to start this off by enumerating the threats to which we are exposed and prioritizing these threats. These threats are going to be affecting assets that we must also prioritize. And then we're going to establish for each combination of threat and asset, what is the control or what are the controls that we can use to protect those particular assets from those particular threats. And we can actually use this framework to assess if we have the appropriate and sufficient controls to mitigate or eliminate the threats to the particular assets. Overall, what we're trying to do here is that given that we have a limited budget to be invested in security, we're trying to decide where should those dollars go to. We're trying to optimize the allocation of our security budget into what is most important and what is most dangerous to the firm. So how could this security plan look like? An easiest way of viewing this, which is inspired on an example by Fitzgerald and Dennis, by the way, is as a table. And in this table, on the first column, we're going to list down our assets along with their priority. For instance, we can see in this example that in the bottom rows, the client's database and the finance database have a 100 out of 100 priority. These are the utmost important assets in our firm. However, we see that the workstations on the 6th floor only have a 50 out of 100 in their priority scale. And we can think of, well, who defined this priority? Was it the CIO? Was it the manager? For the CIO, every single equipment would be important, so it doesn't make much sense. For the marketing manager who works on the 6th floor, for my example, well, for him, maybe the marketing computers are the most important across the entire firm. So he would assign in very high priority to his own workstations. However, perhaps this priority actually came from a consensus-based decision from an IT government that compared in relative terms how relevant were these computers relative to, a more operational department perhaps, or to the servers where the operation runs. We don't know the criteria, but we know that this priority came as a business decision, not taken by any individual person in the firm, but actually by a security committee or by an IT government, some team of experts that were working behind this. So that's the first column. In the first row, what we're doing is that we're now listing the potential threats. And this is a very short list that has the sole purpose of serving as example. Lists are always going to be much longer, and at minimum they should include both business continuity and intrusion threats. So in the business continuity camp, we have fire, floods, power losses, network failures, viruses. All these can disrupt, destruct, or cause a disaster to our infrastructure. And we also have intrusion that can come from external or internal intruders. So where do controls come in? Well, in the cells in between. And what we're doing is now assigning specific control for each combination of asset and threat. For instance, if we want to protect our mail server from a fire in the top left cell, we use controls 1 and 2. Control 1 is a disaster recovery plan, which is a subsection of the overarching security plan that documents the procedures and the actors that must be involved in, for example, restoring backups to reestablish operation in case the mail server fails. Also, if we're talking about a fire, we would also want to have a fire suppression system, which is the control number 2. Now, if we want to protect the mail server from a flood, we will also document how we're going to recover from this in the disaster recovery plan, but now we're going to take a different measure, which is to not have this physical server on or below floor level, because this is where water can accumulate. We can go on and protect all our equipment from power loss. How do we protect from this? We have a power generator plant, or at least a battery, an uninterrupted power supply that will supply enough power to our equipment while we are able to shut them down in a smooth manner. If we have network failures, then what we want to have is redundancy cables, and also have SLAs signed with our telecom providers, and so forth. So once again, what this is allowing us to do is to look at the big picture, look at all the potential threats, look at all the assets that the firm owns, and try to allocate our money, our budget, into where should we invest to protect them. And with this, I'd like to offer you some final considerations. Something very important of a security plan is that even though it's called a plan, it is much more than paper. And when implementing controls, we must consider that there must be people held accountable for maintaining and developing these controls. Controls are not just something that stays on paper. Controls is something that a team of experts sat down to develop, and that they must guarantee that they function effectively. They have tested them. Moreover, in some periodical fashion, they must update and replace the controls in case they feel that the control is no longer sufficient, if it is outdated, if it needs to grow, or even if it's no longer needed, we might drop it and use the budget allocated to that control to something else. And this thing about updating controls is actually very, very, very important. We must verify that the control is present. We must test that the control works. We must perform drills. A common thing that could be done is, for example, just remove the electrical power from a server and see how the firm recovers from having lost that server. Just as how we have fire drills or earthquake drills in firms, we should also have information security drills to see how can we recover. Because sometimes the recovery process might even involve executing manual processes, and our collaborators must be trained on how to execute these manual processes. Moreover, by reviewing the controls with a sufficient frequency, we can actually detect if, for some undocumented reason, there is some temporary procedure that is overriding some control and that renders our current implementation useless. These are all factors that we must consider. And what we want to do at a more high level, at the IT government level indeed, is evaluate if we have a good security plan. So it's worthwhile thinking about what makes a security plan a good one. And it's basically want to consider how adequate each control is to reduce the probability or likelihood of occurrence of a threat. And if that threat occurs, we want to minimize the cost it's going to induce into the firm. So we must define priorities, constantly revisit these priorities. In which controls are we going to invest first? Which threats are the most dangerous? And once again, one of the key points we did early on in this video is that this is not something that concerns only IT. Of course, we're going to have security experts, we're going to have system administrators, we're going to have the network operators. These are all the IT staff involved. Of course, we're going to have them. But security is a strategic business decision. Therefore, in this team, we must have business experts who understand the business value of the different assets and threats, who understand the business implications of all what is going on around security. So let's wrap up with a summary. We started off by mentioning that security has three goals, which were confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility of our data and digitized platform. We know that these security goals were at risk because of threats. And these threats came in two flavors, or there are two types of threats. The first one we mentioned are business continuity threats, which involve the destruction, or disaster. The second type, and perhaps more common or intuitive one, is the threat of intrusion. These threats affect our assets that we're going to be prioritizing based on the value they represent for the business. And we're going to implement controls that mitigate these threats, and controls can detect, prevent, or correct the impact of the threats. All this goes into a security plan, and once again, remember that the goals and the security plan itself should be under the umbrella, under the supervision of an IT government, which is a multidisciplinary team analyzing how do we invest in security. With this, we conclude this video, hoping that you now have a broad understanding of what a security plan is, and that you can now go and talk with some technical experts and start working on your own firm's security plan. Thank you very much.